Did you realise at the beginning of that interview quite what a big deal this was about to become? We knew he'd come back and was missing the French event. Did you know quite how significant that was going to turn out to be?
No, I can honestly say it's the first time I think I've heard an interview with a politician that sparked outrage at that politician before it's even aired.
So this is an exclusive poll for this programme for Good Morning Britain. And let's have a look at the results of it. Those surveyed were asked, thinking about your constituency and the candidates likely to stand. If the general election were tomorrow, which party would you vote for? And there we have Labour ahead by 18 points, the Conservatives 23%, and Reform down quite far behind the Conservatives at 12%, Lib Dems on 10%. Andrew, is that any hope for the Conservatives?
Well, the Tories will be heartened by that, because we've seen some poll. I mean, it's all relative, isn't it? But there have been polls which have shown Reform on 17, just 2 points behind the Tories. There's a huge gap there. Well, I say huge. So the Tories will be heartened by that. But, of course, the lead between the Tories and Labour is still... It's a chasm that can't be filled between now and then.
Is this about tactical voting? And Rishi Sunak saying, if you vote Reform, you'll let Labour in. And people are thinking, well, in that case, I'd better switch back to the Conservatives to try and stop them.
The language, it suggests they know they can't win. This is now about mitigating the scale of the defeat. So the front page of the Daily Mail, don't give Starmer a blank cheque. They're saying if you vote Reform, you're going to get a Labour government with a big majority. Before
we ask you, Kevin, about it, I want to show the viewers on tactical voting what our Survation poll for Good Morning Britain shows. 45% are prepared to vote for a party which is not their first choice if it meant denying a party that they didn't want to win.
I've done it myself in general elections, and you kind of think, well, if your favoured choice has no chance of winning, you then vote against the party you really don't want. And it's, more and more people are doing it. It's a form of electoral reform without ever changing the law, because we have that winner-takes-all system, first past the post. But that will be bad for the Conservatives, because it will be a lot of Labour, Lib Dem tactical voting.
So explain what would actually happen. In your case, who did you vote for and who might you have voted for?
Well, of course, it's a secret ballot, but I voted to get rid of Zach Goldsmith, who was a
Conservative candidate.
Conservative, yeah. And the Tories had won it by about 50 votes the previous election. Lib Dems were clearly second. Labour was nowhere, so I voted Lib Dem.
So, and normally you would have voted
I've got to admit, I voted Lib Dem tactically in 2019. I feel dirty doing it. But...
So you were one of the 45% prepared to vote for a party not your first choice, but in order to defeat a candidate you didn't want to win.
No, exactly. And I think a lot of people do it now.
Andrew, have you ever done that?
I think if there was I think in '97 I was in a constituency where the Labour vote was so enormous, I voted for an independent.
Oh.
Just because it was.
That doesn't sound like a tactical vote.
No, it was just. I just thought I'm not going to.
That sounds like a protest vote.
It was a protest vote, yeah. But it was an independent who was respected locally. So and I thought I voted on a local issue.
Just on this, how important is the character of your MP? I mean, for instance, if you look at the number one concern for voters, cost of living, no surprise, is the main concern. NHS, no surprise, the second concern. But conduct of government is people's third concern. Now, are people voting because they don't like how the government has dealt with, for instance, Partygate? Or are they voting on, actually, you know what, I like my local MP and I think they conduct themselves well, whichever party it is.
It'd be hard to vote for a slime ball. I mean, somebody you thought was really sleazy and unsavoury, wouldn't it? I mean, it'll matter. I think the party label is most important in the majority of constituencies, but the personality, it'll be worth several thousand votes.
Yeah, and if you've been an MP for a very long time, the incumbency factor helps a lot, I think.
Also, being an MP for a very short time also helps, because people normally
well, they don't know how bad you
in their second election, and then as they get used to you,
they get fed up.
They get a bit fed up.
But if you're a sitting MP, you will probably, if you're a good sitting MP,
you'll have done a lot of work for people.
Exactly, a lot of casework. You'll have helped people. If you haven't helped them, well, then you deserve the blowback that will come your way.
Also interesting is what's at the other end of the number one concerns for voters. So the issues which are not bothering people. Right at the bottom is Brexit. Only 1% said Brexit.
It's the dog that hasn't barked in this election at all.
That's a good way of describing it. Apart from the Lib Dems.
A little. Well, you couldn't get Daisy Cooper that day saying, would the Lib Dems take us back into the EU? We know they want to, but she wouldn't say it.
No.
So Brexit 1%, foreign policy 2%, crime only 2%.
Amazing.
I'm surprised at crime, but Brexit, until the referendum came along in 2016 and there was this mania, it was rarely in the top 6 or 10 big issues that concerned people. There was a smaller number of people absolutely obsessed with it to drag Britain out of the European Union.
Labour don't want to talk about it because Keir Starmer was the Brexit spokesman under Jeremy Corbyn.
Hang on.
He was a Brexit spokesman under Jeremy Corbyn, who advocated the second referendum, so they just would like that neatly buried.
Keir Starmer doesn't want to talk about it. When am I hearing Rishi Sunak talk about it on the other side, who backed Brexit in 2016? Because, of course, what happened is...
A lot of Labour supporters want to go back in the European Union, Kevin, and he won't mention it.
You're right, Starmer doesn't want to talk about it because he doesn't want to fight an old battle, but nor does Sunak, because it's been a pile of manure.
I'll tell you something else that Rishi Sunak is finding very awkward and didn't realise he was going to have to talk about over and over again was when he left the Normandy beaches last Thursday and then admitted and apologised for making a mistake. Now, of course, part of the reason that he came back, people thought, was because of an interview with this man, Paul Brand, our very own Paul Brand. Paul, you were then in the firing line, weren't you? Because people said, well, honestly, this is the guy who revealed Partygate, and now he's the guy that Rishi Sunak has had to come back and do an interview with. Before we have a listen to what Rishi Sunak said, just talk our viewers through whether Rishi Sunak was brought back from the Normandy beaches on your command.
I wish I had that power, Susanna. Absolutely not. We can't just snap our fingers and ask a Prime Minister to come back from Normandy, nor would we ever, of course. My grandfather fought in World War II. I wouldn't dream of asking a leader to miss such an important commemoration. The way these things work is we always profile all the party leaders on the Tonight programme in the run-up to an election campaign. And, of course, that involves some conversation about when and where we can go and sit down with that party leader. So we've been speaking to them over the course of about a week, the Conservative Party. We gave them a selection of different days that we could come and see Rishi Sunak, and we were told, no, the only time he can do is Thursday afternoon. We weren't aware of his diary. We didn't know he was leaving Normandy early, and actually it's transpired since then. He said himself that he was always planning to leave Normandy early to get back to the UK and to get on with various campaign things as it transpired, and our interview was one of those things.
When an interviewee sits down with an interviewer, there's normally a little bit of preamble. I don't think the Prime Minister realised how much that preamble would have an impact. And let's have a listen to it now.
Very nice to see you. Hey, sorry to have
well,
kept
thanks
you.
No, not at all. I know you've been in Normandy.
Yeah, it all just ran over. It was incredible, but it just ran over everything.
I'm sure it was
so apologies for keeping you.
No, not at all. I'm sure it was a powerful trip. I mean, so pertinent as well this year, you know, considering what's happened in Ukraine.
Yeah, which I haven't seen President Biden's remarks, but I think that's kind of the echo, I think, what he said.
Did you get to meet any of the veterans, or were you...
Oh, no,
did you just have to do the ceremonial?
Lots. Over yesterday and today. Yeah, I've already spoke to almost everyone that was there, I hope.
Paul, the Prime Minister will watch that clip back now and just feel kind of huge pain and remorse and anguish, and saying, that it overran. He clearly didn't realise at that point quite what a massive storm was about to build that Thursday afternoon. Ended up with him apologising on the Friday morning. I just wondered, did you realise at the beginning of that interview quite what a big deal this was about to become. We knew he'd come back and was missing the French event. Did you know quite how significant that was going to turn out to be?
No, I can honestly say it's the first time I think I've heard an interview with a politician that sparked outrage at that politician before it's even aired. At that moment, when we were sitting down with the Prime Minister, events in Normandy were still continuing. And it was only really, I think, when those images of world leaders meeting were broadcast and the British Prime Minister was so apparently absent that the outrage began to spread. So at this moment, quite frankly, I don't think anyone really knew just how outraged the country was going to be at Rishi Sunak's absence from those important meetings with world leaders. And when we left that interview, actually the outrage still hadn't really begun. It was about sort of 5 o'clock by the time we emerged. And it was only really when the evening news started going out around 6 that people started to say, you know, why has a British Prime Minister missed such an important occasion? And then when we put some clips out from our interview, which were quite time sensitive about all the tax rows that had been going on, we didn't want to leave those waiting on the shelf for another week. It was only at that point then people put 2 and 2 together and said, right, well, he's obviously come back to continue campaigning. And they were even more angry about that.
That's so interesting. I wonder if you hadn't sat down with him, Paul, whether it would have blown up in the way that it did.
Potentially. I mean, I don't know what else he had in his diary that day. There's talk that he was signing off the manifesto that evening. So it is possible that it would have still have blown up when people saw his absence from those photos, and then questions were asked to Conservative campaign headquarters, where is he? I suppose the thing about the interview is it was just a very visual representation of his absence from Normandy, and it was a very easy way for people to verify that he had left early in order to continue electioneering.
So it was one of the big issues, obviously, and then it became a massive issue. But there were other things, Paul, that you talked to the Prime Minister about. What, for you, were the other notable zingers?
So, of course, we talked to him a lot about policy, as you'd expect, and we go back over the past 14 years of Conservative government. He defends the record. He says things have improved, despite 75% of people in recent polling saying things have got worse since 2010. But I think the one thing he really struggles with sometimes when he's asked about it is his wealth, which is a double-edged sword for Rishi Sunak. On the one hand, you know, it's a great success. He's the grandson of immigrants. He's worked his way up the ladder in Britain, and he is now a very, very wealthy man. His party celebrate that success. But on the flip side, he's a prime minister during a cost of living crisis when people are asking, can you actually connect with the severe hardship that some people are feeling in the country? And so obviously that was something I wanted to explore with him. And I think you guys have got a clip here of when I asked him whether there was something he'd ever gone without. And I think the answer here is quite telling in terms of the fact that he hasn't really personally experienced sacrifice before as a politician.
Have you ever gone without something?
Yeah, I mean, my family emigrated here with very little, and that's how I was raised. I was raised with the values of hard work.
What did you go without as a child?
I went out with lots of things, right? Because my parents wanted to put everything into our education, and that was a priority.
So what sort of things had to be sacrificed?
Lots of things, right? So,
Can you give me an example
all
of something?
sorts of things. So, like lots of people, there'll be all sorts of things that I would have wanted as a kid that I couldn't have, right? Famously, Sky TV.
Okay.
So that was something that we never had growing up, actually.
I've got to say, Paul, that is a brilliant piece of interviewing, and having been on the other end of that, I know exactly what it feels like, because you've asked him this question, what did you go without? And then you ask a second time, and his mind is desperately thinking, I don't know the answer, I don't know what to say. And he's desperately hoping you'll move on, and you come back a third time, and he's thinking, I've got to say something, and then he then says, Sky TV, and I tell you, the moment he said that, he's thinking, why did I say that? Because it's sort of so odd. I mean, back then, in the early 1990s, almost nobody had Sky TV. The idea that you went without for not having a Sky TV when he was a young teenager in his family, it only started 1989, Sky Sports in 1991, but he was 11, 12, 13. Almost nobody in the country really had Sky TV. It was only really after the Premier League it started to take off. But you got him because I tell you, the trauma in that moment, he would have been much more worried about the Sky TV moment than anything about D-Day. until
D-Day.
he saw what happened over the course of the evening.
Also, Paul, I just want to ask about, you know, the other person who looms large in his political campaigning is not necessarily Sir Keir Starmer, who I don't think anyone could accuse of looming large, but Nigel Farage. What did he have to say about the leader of Reform?
Yeah, it's interesting, Susanna. I think this was actually the part of the interview where Rishi Sunak got most irritable. You could tell that he is a bit rattled by the fact that Nigel Farage has entered the race. You'd expect him to be. Of course, Reform UK is stealing votes potentially from Conservatives on the right wing of politics. And I asked him repeatedly what he thought of Nigel Farage, how he felt about Nigel Farage. I think it's just quite telling, not so much what he says here, but what his demeanour is. Have a look.
What do you think are Nigel Farage's best qualities?
I really don't know him, Paul. I think I've met him maybe once in my life. I don't know.
Do you feel threatened by him?
No. I'm talking to everyone across the country about my plans for this country.
You're not worried he's going to steal votes from the Conservative Party?
At the end of the day, as I said, one of two people is going to be Prime Minister on July 5th. It's either Keir Starmer or me. A vote for anyone who's not a Conservative candidate is a vote to put Keir Starmer in office.
My goodness. The thing is, Paul, people often think the aggressive, haranguing interviewers are the toughest ones, but the nice, friendly person asking a brilliant question are the toughest ones, and that was just like a tough question. And he didn't have an answer at all, did he?
No. Paul, what your sort of, after leaving that interview, what was your sense of where it left the Prime Minister?
I think for me, the sort of abiding impression was that issue around wealth. I know it's something that irritates him to some degree to continually be asked about his wealth. But as I say, it's just that juxtaposition here. Everyone wants to know that their Prime Minister can relate to them in some way. Keir Starmer has his own relatability issue, and we'll be talking to him for sure about that when we sit down with him in a couple of weeks. But it's just that issue here that Rishi Sunak, when asked, you know, what's the greatest sacrifice, comes up with Sky TV when other people are going out without heating and food at this time in our country's history. I think that is probably the moment that will stay with me for the longest. And then, of course, the Normandy moment, which, as we've discussed, I hadn't quite anticipated at that point.
I think the question, though, Paul, is when a politician is behind in the polls, it's a real test. I mean, do they keep going? Do they have the strength and the determination, or do they start to wilt and to withdraw and kind of lose their mojo? What did you think about the Prime Minister's demeanour when you were with him for that interview?
I think you've got to give him some credit, actually, Rishi Sunak. And Ed, you'll know this better than any of us, what it must feel like to continually be, you know, the subject of negative headlines in the newspapers and constantly told that your campaign is doomed. You know, any of us, I'm sure, would feel demotivated by that in life. And yet Rishi Sunak, you know, bounded into that interview, perhaps in terms of coming back from Normandy. That was a fault of his to have bounded into that interview. But nevertheless, you do have to admire his energy and his ability to keep going. I think even when he was apologising over the Normandy affair, at that point, I think some people would have just crumbled and said, I give up, quite frankly. But he keeps going. He launched his manifesto yesterday, again, with great energy. So I do think one quality that Rishi Sunak has is he is incredibly hardworking and he keeps going no matter what. And that is something you've got to give him some credit for.
I think that's right.
Paul, it's good to talk to you this morning. It's such an, it's an explosive interview, and you didn't. We always knew you'd get great headlines from it. You're an outstanding journalist, but even you didn't realise you'd get these headlines. And finally, the interview that Rishi Sunak did after coming back from D-Day last Thursday, it finally goes out tonight, ITV1, 7 p.m. Paul, thanks very much indeed for joining us this morning. I mean, you can imagine Rishi Sunak he probably doesn't want that going out now, does he?
It's not as if it wasn't going to come up, this question. He's fantastically rich. The Sunday Times rich list made his family's wealth even greater. It went up by about 100.
Richer than the king.
Richer than the king. So he knows these questions are coming, and I think there's just a way of dealing with it, which is, I was very lucky. My parents worked very hard to send me to private school. I got a scholarship. I was very lucky and had a privileged upbringing. That's not a fault.
Kevin, because Boris Johnson didn't grow up in poverty.
No.
but owned everything that he was accused of not being relatable about. I wonder whether Rishi Sunak is apologising too much.
Well, he's cold and technocratic, isn't he? And we can say the same about Keir Starmer to some degree when you look at them. It is, look, you can get to a point where you become incredibly remote. And I think if you're worth $750 million or whatever the figure is, and you are richer than the king or judged to be richer than the king, you just get really far removed. And he's had this gilded escalator ride to the top. There you go to Winchester, one of the poshest, most privileged, expensive private schools.
Boris Johnson
you go to two top universities in the UK and America.
Most prime ministers go to a top private school.
You marry an heiress. You become a casino banker. Absolutely fabulous. You get a plum Tory suit.
But all of those are facts, aren't they? I just wonder is the way he deals with it.
Then you find yourself prime minister really quickly. For the first time in his life, that rise up is shuddering
Boris Johnson wore his class lightly, the fact he went to Eton lightly. He was just completely relaxed in his own skin. He came from a fantastically privileged, wealthy background. It didn't matter. Look how he related behind the red wall. He won huge votes from Labour voters.
Sunak is a different level.
It's about authenticity, though. That is the problem. It's not actually about wealth.
Yes.
I remember I made these films about Donald Trump for the BBC.
You tell that to people without any wealth when you say it's not about wealth.
No, but...
You tell it to people who are suffering.
Well, look,
you can't.
hang on,
It is about wealth.
Kevin, a lot of the people who were suffering and having a hard time voted Tory in 2019 and gave Boris Johnson a majority of 80, 90, 100. And hang on a second, the point I was going to make is when you talk to Trump voters, lots of Trump voters say he's wealthy, he's not in it for the money, he can be on my side. The problem with that interview is not Rishi Sunak being wealthy, it's trying to pretend that he'd had a hardship which didn't ring true. It's the authenticity which is much bigger deal than the wealth.
Sunak is wealthy, way beyond Johnson or even Cameron or Starmer, and it has made him remote. He's in an ivory tower. He's had that escalator all up to his ivory tower.
Prime Minister if you're rich. What's wrong with rich people being in politics? There's no problem with it.
You've admitted in the past.
It's how he handles it.
It's how he handles it.
I think it flies in the face of the history.
Michael Heseltine was one of the richest people who's ever been in the Commons, and nobody talked about his wealth.
So interesting. Right,